Здравствуйте, доброе утро, good morning, and welcome to the Euractiv online conference, Human Rights in Kazakhstan, the road ahead. My name is Georgi Gotev. I'm senior editor with Euractiv.com, and I regularly report on Central Asia and Kazakhstan in particular. If you read Euractiv Bulgaria behind my back, that's because I'm in Sofia. I'm also the proud publisher of Euractiv Bulgaria. As you know, Euractiv is the European media network, and we bring together stakeholders from Europe and also from different nations. Today, we have two outstanding keynote speakers, Elvira Zimova, Human Rights Commissioner of Kazakhstan, and Jemis Gambentova, Executive Director of the Public Fund, Charter for Human Rights of Kazakhstan, in our Euractiv office in Brussels. They will speak in Russian, and translation will be provided. I think that online conferences are great because the distance doesn't matter. Distances should not be important when the relations between the countries are close. Recently, I interviewed Yerzhan Kazikhan, a special representative of the President of Kazakhstan for International Cooperation, who called the EU a distant neighbor of Kazakhstan. I really like this formulation. And I have had the honor and the pleasure to interview recently Elvira Zimova. Actually, it was online because in the context of the COVID crisis, I didn't travel to Kazakhstan and the region as much as I wished to. Let's hope the situation is changing. In this interview, we discussed the European Parliament resolution adopted in February, which criticized Kazakhstan for its human rights record. I'm not going to repeat what Mrs. Azimova said. You can find the interview on our website. But in a nutshell, the Kazakh position is that this resolution was biased and that the EU should not ignore or discourage the efforts to improve the country's record on human rights. Notably, the country's president, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, last month signed a decree on further measures of the Republic of Kazakhstan in the field of human rights, which as he said, represent an important step in the political modernization of the country. In my journalistic experience, I see Kazakhstan as a country which doesn't reform under foreign pressure, as it was the case for some countries in the eastern part of Europe, but because its leadership considers that reforms are good for the nation and for its citizens. President Tokayev has introduced the notion of a listening state and has embarked in what I have called many times in my articles, controlled democratization. Vis-à-vis the EU, Kazakhstan is not a demandeur. It does not want to join the Union, but it wants the best relations which are beneficial both economically and also for a healthy geopolitical balance. In that sense, if Kazakhstan improves its human rights records, it would not be because of EU pressure. And actually, sometimes EU pressure can be counterproductive. This is my perspective. Thank you for your patience for my introductory remarks. I'm only an observer, and if you disagree with me, I would be glad to give you the floor in the second part of our meeting. You can push the ask button and put down your question, indicating your name and to whom you are asking the question. But I would like now to give the floor for welcoming remarks to the Ambassador of Kazakhstan to the EU, Belgium, Mr. Margulan Baymukhan, who arrived recently and whom I had the honor and the pleasure to meet physically in a nice surrounding in beautiful Ukla. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for your invitation, and I'm really happy to join today's online conference, and I hope we will have good discussion about the topic which you mentioned before, Mr. Gotov, and let me allow to give the remarks, my short speech, and about our meeting. And dear Georgy Gotov, dear Commissioner Elvira, Zimova, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your joining us today. I'm delighted to meet you, and I'm looking forward to inspiring conversation to further enhance Kazakhstan-EU relations, especially on such an important track as the rule of law and human rights. A little over a year ago, the Kazakhstan-EU Enhanced Partnership and Cooperation Agreement entered into force. The ACPCA is a landmark agreement and the first of its kind of its region. The key challenge for all of us now lies in the implementation of cooperation agreed in the 29th fields of work. The PCA also underpins Kazakhstan's effort to further improve the respect for human rights and the rule of law. Further enhancing the human rights situation is a priority action. I therefore wish to underline that Kazakhstan is actively engaged in a human rights dialogue with the EU. The 12th and the most recent annual Kazakhstan-EU human rights dialogue took place last November. As equal partners, both sides openly and frankly discussed a broad range of human rights issues. The visit of our Commissioner for Human Rights and the member of the National Commission of Public Trust, it's demonstrate the fact that Kazakhstan is ready to work constructively with European partners and invite key stakeholders from Kazakhstan to Brussels so that European experts and politicians can get information firsthand. Let me firstly assure you that Kazakhstan continues to be committed to its international human rights obligations. In this regard, I ask our today's guests to consider Kazakhstan's gradual reform efforts against the largest historical background. Kazakhstan is a young country that celebrates 30 years of independence in this year. We have made great strides within a short time frame, and we will continue to deliver on our ambitious reforms plans. As you know, Kazakhstan is a full-fledged participant of more than 60 universal international human rights treaties, including the 7 core UN Conventions on Human Rights, the so-called core international human rights instruments. Secondly, it's important to stress our understanding that the Kazakhstan and EU are indeed equal partners. As such, we should support each other's efforts to offer our citizens the best possible socio-economic and political framework to thrive. To ensure a regular exchange of views in this regard, we suggested creating a working group between Kazakhstan Minister of Justice and the EU delegation in Nur-Sultan that would meet on a monthly basis. Dear guests, our guest from Kazakhstan, dear Mr. Gotov, in this spirit, I am looking forward to your conversation with Madame Azimova and Madame Jemis Turmagambetova. I wish us an interesting discussion. Thank you for your attention. I hope and we will have a good opportunity now in order to exchange our point of views in different fields. Thank you very much for your attention.
EU and Kazakhstan are equal partners. Now again, some housekeeping. After the two keynote speakers will finish their remarks, so you will be able to ask questions in writing, pressing the Ask button. When you put down your question, please identify yourself and mention to whom you are asking your questions. And now, without further ado, I will give the floor to Elvira Zimova, Human Rights Commissioner of Kazakhstan. Dear Elvira Zimova, thank you for being with us in Brussels. It's a honor. The floor is yours.
Я приветствую не только вас, уважаемый господин Готов, но и тех, кто сейчас смотрит настоящую конференцию.
Watching and listening us at the moment, and I think that there are some positive and reasonable conclusions that will be made by all of us after we hold this dialogue. In fact, when we talk about human rights and when we talk about the obligations of the state to observe and respect its obligations, I think it's very important to assess the situation in the state and particular steps or actions that draw the attention of both the external observers and those inside the country, because it is very important to arrive at a mutually acceptable solution that would not just generate emotions, be they negative or positive, but also would help us to make sure that these violations do not become systemic and will not be seen as egregious violations. If we were to speak about Kazakhstan, our distinguished ambassador has already mentioned this. Kazakhstan is indeed a young state, and we gained our independence 30 years ago. And the most important in the stance of Kazakhstan is that in any international dialogue, we never say, we are only a young state, please give us some time, we will do this later after we've increased our capacity. We do not do this. And I think this is a very important thing, because despite being so young, despite its young age, our country continues to grow and it continues to identify new objectives. If we were to talk about the most recent trends, I can say as an ombudsman that I was elected in September 2019. I was elected by the Senate of the Parliament. In Kazakhstan's history, I am the third ombudsman, but actually the system that is enshrined in the Constitution in 2017 means that there's now an election of an ombudsman. So I went through this process of election, and I think I need to say that after a fairly lengthy period, this office was first established in 2002 in Kazakhstan, and currently we are growing the capacity of this office of the ombudsman as someone who is not only observing the situation with regards to human rights, but also who introduces suggestions. Of course, it is very important for me to have supporters. I cannot make exceptions. I cannot favor NGOs, because the parliament is the legislative body that is supposed to be adopting laws that will work in favor and for the good of the nation of Kazakhstan. Also, I cannot exclude civil society representatives, because they can have a differing opinion and other suggestions, different suggestions. But my job is to consolidate various opinions and try and arrive at a consolidated position, because only this can help us to arrive at a sustainable approach and elaborate an acceptable position that will be welcomed by most people, by the majority. So I guess this is not just the ombudsman's approach, but also the approach of the political parties and public organizations who have long-term objectives, who hope to be here for a long time and meet their goals in the future. The same can be said about Kazakhstan. We are currently a full-fledged member of the UN. And the first thing I would like to mention is that, yes, indeed, Kazakhstan has signed the Enhanced Cooperation and Partnership Agreement between Kazakhstan and EU member states. And in fact, this agreement came into force very recently. But I can tell you that unlike the old agreement, the partnership agreement, this agreement is comprehensive. And it envisages a number of areas of cooperation between the EU and Kazakhstan. And I wanted to point out two very important things about this agreement. Is that the first one is that we have chapters dedicated to the cooperation between the EU and Kazakhstan as related to the democratic development, rule of law, and human rights. And the second aspect means that the process of dialogue includes not only the official authorities of the EU and Kazakhstan, but also the civil society. And in fact, civil society in partnership in a tripartite format is the subject of a separate article, separate chapter in the agreement. And I would like for this chapter to be fully engaged, fully active, and the upcoming civic forum that will be attended by representatives of the EU, and as some of the MEPs who we met yesterday mentioned, they will also be taking part. And this is extremely important because we need to be hearing not only the opinion of the official circles, we need to be hearing also the opinions of the NGOs and those citizens who are living in European member states and in Kazakhstan. And I can say that it is not always that the opinions of the official authorities, and Mr. Gotov, you have mentioned the European Parliament resolution, it doesn't always coincide with the official line, the official human rights line. We need to be proceeding from the fact that these are individual rights. And if you define for yourself, if you were to take the issue of domestic violence, for example, you can say that domestic violence is unacceptable. I can tell you that some people believe that the official line on the official stance on combating domestic violence actually undermines traditional values. So we need to understand that this is a very complicated process, an extremely complicated process where the opinion of the public and the official opinion need to coincide. Obviously, we will have dimensions. We will have, on the one hand, the rights of the individuals. On the other hand, we will have the rights of the majority. And what we see in the European Union is the vaccination campaign. We can see what is going on, what is happening with personal data. I know that this is an issue that's been up for debate for quite some time. And obviously, we're not excluded from this process. We have different opinions, because this is an issue of the relationship between the rights of the individual and the rights of the majority. Of course, in Kazakhstan, we cannot ignore the processes that are taking part in our country. And during our visit, I was planning to actually say that you cannot assess or evaluate a country remotely from a distance without having visited it. We need to look to our citizens. They have more freedom of movement. Of course, during the pandemic, that freedom of movement has been restricted, but there's a theory that says that at some point in the future, our borders of the Schengen area or Kazakhstan will not be a barrier. Same as our conference today. When you are in Bulgaria, we are located in Brussels, we're talking to each other, and that's just part of our daily life, and we can try and resist it, but these processes are taking place. Another thing is that we need to identify some red flags or green flags, red lines that we cannot cross. So we can say we can go here, and we need to create better conditions. We need to make sure that the main principles are respected, human rights. And this is why we have this term, and I really like it, egregious violation of human rights. when Kazakhstan speaks in an international arena, when it undertakes obligations, it always says that it is unacceptable to commit egregious violations of human rights. As an ombudsman, I can say that in the history of EU member states, Kazakhstan, and globally, many states have adopted various models for this office. In some countries, there's a parliamentary model. In some countries, it's a presidential model. In some countries, it's basically a part of the government. So it is an official that represents the Ministry of Justice, for example, or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We know that in some countries this model exists as well for the Ombudsman's office. But I think the most important thing is that in all of these models, this office really aims to give an independent analysis of the human rights situation in the country. As for me, as an ombudsman, I cannot ignore the things that are happening, the processes that are ongoing in Kazakhstan. And I recognize that this trend is positive. We are growing our capacity. Obviously, there are difficult things. And my position and the human rights defender's position doesn't always coincide with the position of the government. But we need to be talking, we need to be consulting. And for the relationship between the EU and Kazakhstan, this is obviously also not an exception. We need to have this dialogue at all levels, at the level of official circles and at the unofficial level as well. So I wanted to thank those MEPs whom I met already, and Madam Zimova, Gambentova met them with me. Among them, there are MEPs with different positions, different opinions, but we were united in our desire to understand the real situation and to understand what the process is and how it's going. In Kazakhstan in 2009, forwarded an open invitation to all of the special procedures of the UN, and our president, Mr. Tokayev, took the decision to accede to two more committees of the UN, apart from the four that we have already acceded to. It's the Committee on the Rights of the Child and Committee on the Rights of the Disabled People. And we know that these things are watched very closely by our public, and this is also the things that are being evaluated in each country, because we're talking about equal opportunities for all social groups. So in this regard, there is another question: how do we do it? How do we ensure it? And how do we create a functioning mechanism, not only to submit complaints, but also how does the state then respond to these complaints? So when we say that Kazakhstan is open to dialogue, we need to be looking at how the country implemented these norms in its legislation. Secondly, how is there a real mechanism for implementation? Because sometimes we can have a perfect sounding law, and I think the EP resolution is ideal from the point of view of universal values. But if we wanted to see the mechanism, if we wanted to see the efficiency of this instrument, we need to see how it works locally. We need to see how the human rights defenders are working. They are working with the grassroots, how human rights are being promoted, how these values are being promoted. And when we talk about laws, and when we talk about the basic law, the fundamental law in the Constitution, sometimes these laws can be great sounding, but when we actually start looking at the real situation, we can see good things and bad things. Obviously, we need to be working on the bad things, but there's a third thing here, and that's the fact that we need to create our own models, because country will have its own mentality, its own interests and ideologies, and they cannot be ignored. European countries interprets and positions some of the values in a particular way, but doesn't always apply to, say, an Asian country. And so the most important thing is the end result, which should not be in conflict with the basic values that are enshrined in the international document. And this is the path that we have chosen. Kazakhstan has said that the values that are enshrined in the declaration and UN conventions, they are the priority. And our current president is a professional diplomat. And he understands, like nobody else, he understands that there needs to be balance, there needs to be a harmony between the international obligations that we have committed to and our national obligations that we have committed to, our citizens. And this is why I'm very happy that we have a dialogue with our government. Mr. Gotov, you mentioned the decree, the presidential decree. And I wanted to mention that actually it is a very important decree because it is testimony to the fact that our state is committed to a gradual development of human rights as a very important area of our national policy. We have previously always said that the economy comes first, the economic situation comes first, human rights second. Now we are at a different level. The country is much more stable, and we can say that, in fact, human rights are a very important area. And when we work with our investment policies or economic policies, or when we implement policies aimed at the support of entrepreneurship, we cannot ignore human rights. Because if we were to talk about our partners, if we were to talk about Kazakhstan and the EU, we need to understand that human rights are the cornerstone of all of the major political documents signed or adopted by our governments. So to say that we do not approach in an acceptable way the commitments that we have undertaken, I think that would be wrong to say. And in this sense, I am happy that in the presidential decree issued by our president, Mr. Tokayev, we clearly see, he says that the state must report every year about the measures it has taken, steps that it has taken, and the state has identified priority measures. Obviously, not everyone believes that all of the issues are part of this plan. We have 26 steps in this plan for now, but these are very important issues that were raised by civil society, and we will continue to work. We will continue to make sure that this package is expanded, is deepened. On the other hand, we need to understand that when we speak about the elaboration of any kind of roadmap in the area of human rights, we also need to have indicators which will help us to measure the efficiency of our achievements. Of course, I might be mistaken, but I think that some of the EU member states adopted similar national action plans for human rights, but it would not be sufficient just to adopt a roadmap. What you need is not only identified priorities, but also indicators of efficiency, of performance. And the government as the government has identified the adoption of performance indicators in human rights In relation to Sustainable Development Goals, this is the UN Agenda for 2030, SDGs. There are very important 17 goals that have been signed by all of the member states in the General Assembly of the United Nations. And what has been identified for us, that the indicators and performance measurement has to be, for us, needs to be linked to SDGs, actually shows to a very balanced perception, very balanced approach, not only from the state, but also from the civil society, because we can approach the same thing, the same situation, or the same dish. But if in the end we only have a statement or a pronouncement of some kind, that's not enough. If we want to continue the dialogue, if we want to say that we need to be moving in a slightly different direction, then we need to talk about models of implementation that seem to be the best to us. And we need to try and convince our partners. We need to discuss these things, and not a single country, has a ready recipe, universal recipe for this. Every country has its own path, and this path should not differ from the obligations and commitments that were undertaken internationally.
Thank you, Elvira Zimova. We'll continue the discussion. I'm going to ask you, but later, I'm going to ask you to elaborate on what you said, that in terms of values, they do not apply in the same way to Asian countries. This is something that I didn't understand quite well. Also, I will ask you to inform us about this upcoming civic forum. Maybe give us some dates so we can put it in our agenda. You have raised many interesting questions, but now I think that it is time that we continue our discussion with the initial statement by Zhemis Turma Gambentova, Executive Director of the Public Fund Charter for Human Rights. You have the floor, Mrs. Turma Gambentova.
Слово, госпожа Турма. Thank you very much, and good morning to our listeners and viewers. To everyone who's watching us and listening to us. Can you hear me? I am not sure if I can be heard. Seeing as we do not have very much time until Q&A, I will tell you very briefly about my record as a human rights defender. My human rights activities started in December '86 after we had some tragic events in the city of Almaty. The December events, as they're known in the history of our country. In 1989, when for the first time at the party congress, there was an urgent call to try and investigate these events, I became a volunteer. And then I headed one of the working groups of the committee to investigate these events. Secondly, my human rights activities started in a more conscious way in 1989, when my colleagues and I Evgeny Zhovtis and my other colleagues also establishing groups. We were trying to find our way in this whole subject, human rights subject. And I witnessed the creation of human rights organizations in some of our neighboring countries and some of the Baltic countries as well. And I remember the speeches in the first Congress, Party Congress, that really puzzling for Gorbachev, I suppose. And then in 91 we had the first visit of the General Secretary of RPI, Penal Reform International, Baroness Stern. And this is when I started looking into the problems in the penitentiary system and human rights in the penitentiary system in particular. Unfortunately, in 1995, one of our TV channels showed an execution by shooting, by firing squad, and that was that made an extreme, an immense impression, and this is why I started working towards trying to make sure that capital punishment is abolished in Kazakhstan. And this took it took 25 years of daily struggle and arguing every day that Kazakhstan is no worse than anybody else and that we must join the second optional protocol against capital punishment, and we must legislatively fully abolish the capital punishment. And currently, I am involved in the reform of the law enforcement authorities. We are creating service models of the law enforcement. And I don't suppose I should talk about this in too much detail, but I'd like to address our viewers and our listeners, our critics and our well-wishers. We say that when you're too close, you can't see the big picture. So I wanted to suggest that we can listen to each other, that we do not criticize, that we not condemn, or we do not deny rumors. Actually, a lot of work is being done. The civil society and human rights organizations and the extent of their involvement in the plans that have been identified will determine the extent to which we become a human rights-based state. Some people say we're a young state. Well, actually, I don't agree. We have an ancient history, very long history. And over the history of our nation, we've survived a lot of suffering, famines, all the same things that happened in other post-Soviet states and other states in the world. It's a huge job to defend human rights, and I've gone through all of the stages in my career, starting with complete ignorance and complete rejection of the human rights. And now we are arriving at a consensus of sorts. We are starting to work together. And our human rights organizations still have a huge job to do. We have undertaken a lot of international commitments in Kazakhstan, and we have still a lot to do towards them. That's it for me for now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Zhemisturma Gambentova. When you said we are an ancient state, I remember when I discussed with one of your politicians, Yerman Mukhtar, who said, we don't build walls in the steppe. This is also the title of the interview I did with him. That really explains the culture of Kazakhstan, which is very ancient. So yes, 30 years, that's the modern part, but the culture is indeed ancient. I would like, before I give the floor to questions from the audience, indeed to ask Elvira Zimova to tell us first about this upcoming civil forum she mentioned, and secondly to better explain the idea of the traditional values and human rights in the context of Asian countries and so on, because I'm not sure I really understood, and probably it's useful also for the audience. So Elvira, Zimova, you have the floor.
Форуме, то это форум встречи неправительственных организаций, и, как правило, у нас...
As a rule, in Kazakhstan,
как правило, у нас такой форум происходит
this forum happens every year, and we invite
не только неправительственного сектора, но
NGOs, non-governmental sector, as well as official representatives. And this is a brainstorm session where we discuss our opinions, we elaborate recommendations and suggestions. So basically, it is a dialogue between the non-governmental sector. Because in Kazakhstan, we have more than 22,000 registered non-governmental organizations with different missions. Some of them work with local projects, and they work locally, and some of them aim to analyze or monitor. Some of the organizations have more missions, and the capacity of the non-governmental sector, the organizations, is very different. But we can discuss all of their experiences. On the other hand, we invite officials so they can hear these opinions of the civil society. And as regards the upcoming forum, we will invite our partners, and it will actually be in the context of this enhanced cooperation between the EU and Kazakhstan. In essence, it will be international for the very first time. And I think that's the right thing to do, because this event is exactly in the context of this new enhanced cooperation and partnership agreement that recently came into force. Traditionally, human rights is an obligatory part of their agenda, and I hope that this upcoming forum will be extremely constructive. And secondly, the question you had about some of the Asian traditional values and European values. If we were to talk about human rights, obviously we cannot say these are European human rights and these are Central Asian human rights. Obviously, we have the same human rights. And I don't like this expression, traditional family values. You can't have traditional family values. These are eternal values. Respect in the family, respect for your elders, respect towards your children. Because by respecting the rights of the child, we foster his confidence and his way of how he behaves, how he becomes a member of society. So the actual expression, traditional family values, really does not sound great to me. But there's another thing, such as customs. This can be geopolitical or national customs, traditions, and they cannot be ignored. When we talk about the promotion of human rights, we need to understand that the perception of a good idea that seems like a good idea to a European citizen and, say, to the citizen of Kazakhstan, the perception can be somewhat different due to a number of social conditions, economic conditions, due to customs in a particular locality. This is what I mean. On the other hand, when we talk about human rights and why we ask each other these questions, we need to be looking towards universal international documents, and we need to be looking towards the global trend. So why do we adopt important documents in the UN platform. We always talk about recommendations because everybody understands that each country undertakes obligations, they do it consciously, and we need to promote them in a positive way. And when we look at human rights enshrined in the International Pact on Social and Economic Rights, other rights, other documents related to, say, the rights of the child, we can see that these documents talk about the best way to apply these rights fully. And that's the right thing to do because the children are the next generation, children are the future of each state. So there's a clear priority. Doubtlessly, there's a need to promote these rights of the child. And also there are some vulnerable groups in the society. We need to promote equal rights and opportunities for them. This is an important trend for many countries in the context of SDGs. And when we talk about the eradication of discrimination against women, we need to understand that this needs to happen by providing equal opportunities. If we were to remember the Afghan project to empower women in Afghanistan, in fact, Kazakhstan was one of the first to commit, to undertake an obligation to contribute to the empowerment of women in Afghanistan, which is extremely important. We have another project in Kazakhstan. It's cooperation, women's cooperation. Each woman has opportunities, obviously, but we need to remember that each woman needs to have the right environment, the right conditions in order to be able to enjoy these rights that are enshrined in these important documents. We need to cooperate, we need to unite our efforts, because when non-governmental organizations consolidate and promote human rights, this will be more efficient than if you have only one organization doing this. Same goes for women's rights.
Just a question.
Одну минутку, пожалуйста. I wanted to join the dialogue.
Yes, I will give you the floor immediately. It's just...
So we can talk about different models of human rights, be it European model of rights or African human rights. Human rights are universal, and in the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and many other international documents, we talk about equal rights and opportunities. And if we were to talk further, I guess then each nation has customary law, and individuals, people are always the cornerstone of this common law. And we have the old law, we call it the steppe law, that contains some of the universally recognized standards and norms: respect for your elders, educating of the children, respect for women. In fact, in our customary law, it was always there. And the concept that we had before, economy first, human rights later, it really held back the development of our fundamental rights and freedoms. And the current approach means that human rights come first, before the economy, before other things. I fully welcome this concept and this approach. Until we make sure that the individual rights of an ordinary citizen are respected, we cannot move forward.
When we speak about traditional values, when we speak about customary law, step law, whatever you would like to call it. It doesn't mean that you can beat your wife because this is the traditional way of doing it. We are clear about that. I cannot hear.
It allows people to humiliate women. Please do not interpret this the way you would like to. I never said this. You need to respect the dignity of a woman. It was there before, and it is there, and I hope will be there.
It's very clear. Elvira Zimova, your perspective?
What was said by my colleague, Madam Jamas, her answer really is just a continuation of my answer to your question, the difference between European values and Central Asian values. When we talk about the abolishment of the capital punishment, that's another very important issue that in fact affects many other issues such as the right to life and the right to health. And we need to recognize that despite this very important issue, or the importance of this issue, not all nations have abolished the death sentence. And if we were to look at the history of Kazakhstan, which my colleague has mentioned, never in our society was it used as punishment. We always used more humane ways. The maximum punishment for a serious crime was exile from the clan. So this person would be exiled. He would be living alone, away from his community, from his village, and that was the most serious, the maximum punishment. So when we undertook in the 1990s to move towards the abolishment of the death sentence, and actually we had a moratorium in place for a long time, but even for us it was very difficult to push this forward, because it wasn't just signing a law or signing a decree by which you abolish the death sentence. We needed to persuade our public. This is what Mrs. Gambentova was saying. She dedicated 25 years of her life to persuade the public and the government. And this decision, very important decision, was taken by our president, Mr. Tokayev, to abolish the death sentence. We have gone a very long way, and the public, we think, was persuaded, and obviously there are issues in each country, but from the point of view of the value of human life as such, and it doesn't matter if we are talking about ordinary citizens where the state is obligated to provide access to high-quality healthcare. On the other hand, we are talking about a death sentence as a possible measure for a serious crime. Well, actually, these two very important issues. In these two issues, we can see clearly that we can see the value of human life, and no one can decide who lives and who dies. No one is supposed to take this decision. And when the state has all of the instruments, all of the tools, it can decide what it can offer as an alternative. So it is not really an issue whether we abolish, or whether it's not the only issue whether we abolish or do not abolish the death sentence. Actually, we can now talk about various alternative measures. If the court found someone guilty, obviously the criminal needs to be punished. We need to think what can be offered as an alternative. And if somebody is imprisoned, for example, as a way of punishment. We also need to understand that the UN sets standards for the minimum conditions for detention of inmates, and these standards must not be ignored by anyone. And another thing that our human rights defenders are promoting in the context of the decision of the head of state and all of the relevant ministry, which is the Ministry of Internal Affairs, is doing, they are reforming the penitentiary system. They're improving the conditions in the facilities, detention facilities, so that we can provide these guaranteed minimum conditions of detention of inmates. But the most important issue here is the right of the individual to life and to health. That's a long way. This is a long road, and each country will take its own way towards it. But the main thing is that we actually finish up in the same place. We reach the same goal. And actually, in the framework of the UN Human Rights Council, there is a mechanism called the UPR, Universal Periodic Review, which is the evaluation, assessment of the human rights situation in each country, and each of the member states of the UN Human Rights Council has to go through this UPR, this process, once every 4 years. And since the very beginning of the introduction of this mechanism, we were an active party to this. In the very beginning, I mentioned an open invitation to all of the special procedures of the UN. It is an open invitation. We never called it back. It is an open invitation. Any rapporteur may UN rapporteur may visit Kazakhstan and make their own conclusions and offer their own suggestions and recommendations as to how our human rights policy can best be improved. And in 2019, very recently, we went through the third cycle of UPR, and 87% of the recommendations that were elaborated by the national delegations in the UN Human Rights Council were accepted for implementation by us. This is not 2 or 3. This is 87%, which is another testimony to the fact that we are committed, very clearly committed, to moving towards a policy in this area.
I have only one question from the audience, but I think it's been 1 hour since we are answering that question. It comes from Chingiz. Chingiz asks, to what extent human rights are applied and enforced in Kazakhstan? I think this was the subject of our discussion. Our time is running out. And I would like to give both of you the possibility for a concluding statement. I would like to start with Mrs. Gambentova. You have the floor for final words today.
К сожалению, нет звука. I suppose this is a philosophical question as well as a practical one. We are moving towards a situation where all of the state authorities would respect human rights, not only in the penitentiary system. There's also that should also encompass the police, the healthcare system. So basically, the whole range of issues that are related to human rights in one way or another. So all of our human rights groups, they work with different issues, not with the same one. Some of them work with the healthcare system, some with the pension system, some in the area of education, and all of this needs to be somehow tied together. I don't know if it's always possible, because sometimes you do something, you meet some kind of a goal and objective, and then something else happens, and then you start all over again. So civil society, together with the authorities, I think we can do the maximum, and we need to welcome that. I didn't quite understand the question from Cengiz. What did he actually mean, and in what area?
I can elaborate, because I just received the second part of his question. He says, to what extent the Kazakh government recognizes the definition of human rights set up by EU standards?
Прав человека.
Вообще, мне кажется, что вот мы говорили и будем говорить.
So it seems to me that we have been saying, and we continue to say that human rights are universal. And we cannot say that these human rights are European or Asian or African. Human rights are universal. This is something you get when you are born. And the aspiration of each state, if society, towards a full respect of human rights, and there's a number of them: political, cultural, economic, social, etc., many categories of human rights. So this aspiration is there. The question is, how do we do it? How do we achieve it? And once again, without civil society, without the whole of the population, the government itself alone, by way of decree, will never be able to solve this problem. So we need to keep the dialogue going between the government and the public and the presidential office. It needs to keep going. So the establishment of the Ombudsman's office is now actually gaining momentum. And we must not forget. And this is something that I always say to my colleagues: work constructively. We have different platforms in Kazakhstan. We have the advisory body in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have various public councils in the various executive authorities. And officials, including governmental officials, must not avoid talking about this. They need to be, on the contrary, they need to be listening to the public, and they need to help find a consensus. For the very first time in Kazakhstan, we will have elections in the local authorities. We call them akims. And the next stage will be district akims, and so on and so forth. So we start with the local self-governance. People will decide how to spend the local money, how to develop, where to live, how to improve the place where they live. So there are many things here to discuss, and we can't say that this particular issue is resolved this particular way. I can't say that. If I can pick up on the thought that Madam Zimova has just expressed as an answer to Cengiz's question. I don't know if Cengiz lives in Europe or in Kazakhstan, but I wanted to say to Cengiz and to everyone else who is watching and listening to us, this is the thought I wanted to express. I fully support what Madam Zimova has said, Mrs. Gambentova. From the point of view of human rights itself, there shouldn't be any kind of European standards or Kazakh standards. When it comes to the mechanism of achieving them, well, then the European Union, the European Parliament define their own model, of the mechanism that will help them achieve human rights. And Kazakhstan defines its own model. The government has identified priority measures. We have 3 packages of priority measures that were announced by the president, and another 4th package is also coming up. And the implementation of this mechanism needs to be assessed. It's easy to say that this is wrong and that is right, but not everyone is born as a teacher. To be a good teacher and to promote knowledge, you also have to have good students. So there are different components in this process. You can't live in on an island and somehow be a society if you live alone on an island. If I see some problems in a society, I need to roll up my sleeves, I need to start working. And if I have an idea, a suggestion, I have to convey it and I have to suggest ways of solution. And this is what we have in Kazakhstan right now. This is what Mrs. Gambentova is saying. She's a member of the National Council of Public Trust, which is a council that was established under the auspices of the president, which works on the basis of close contact with the public. And I don't know what's traditional for the European Parliament, but actually our National Council of Trust is made up of ordinary people. So basically they come to the same platform and they talk to the president, and I know that they are now visiting regions, including rural areas. Villages are visited by the members of the National Council of Public Trust. They talk to the local authorities and the local residents. And this process seems to be the most effective because you can't just be a monitor or an auditor. There are many monitors, but somebody has to do the job. And who does the job? It is the country. In our particular case, it's Kazakhstan. In your case, it's the European Union. The European Parliament adopted the Council of Europe and the European Union adopted a convention related to the criminal justice system and the penitentiary system, the rights of the detainees. So I have a question. In a number of European conventions, why is there a right for third parties to accede to this convention? Mr. Gotov, you spoke about European standards. Actually, you didn't mention it. Chingiz mentioned it in his question. So why, by promoting these standards, if you believe that standards are correct, why have you not positively considered Kazakhstan's request to accede to a number of mechanisms in the area of criminal justice and penitentiary systems? This would be the right thing to do, and this will be right in view of the values of the European Union and the Council of Europe. Why not? You will have more partners, and not just the partners who make pronouncements or declarations, but partners who will actually do something. This is an ongoing question, and Chingiz is asking us, is it good or is it bad? I can't say. This is an ongoing process, and yesterday we were talking about the right to privacy, and it means that nobody can enter your residence without your consent. Well, actually, we have the social media today. Everybody can have their own page and can actually share a lot of information, not about themselves, but also about their neighbors, about their colleagues, and that's also interfering in somebody's privacy. Today we have one instrument, but life changes. Tomorrow we might have 5 or 10 instruments. The question is, to what extent does the society, does the country adopt these instruments, and to what extent we use it in our daily life? Do we understand that it is unacceptable to share on a page in social media information about somebody else, about a third person? This is what we need to be working on.
Indeed, Elvira,
we are now
Zimova,
all moving towards universal digitalization. And we all have passwords, ID numbers. So there's a problem there as well. How do we keep our ID numbers, our personal numbers, private, so they're not shared on the social networks? And I can just echo what Mrs. Azimova has just said. My private life, my home is my fortress. And I have to I provide consent to interference in my privacy. Because by interfering in somebody else's privacy, we are breaking the very important rule.
I agree with Ms. Gambentova and with Elvira Zimova. Privacy is a big concern for the European Union, and the European Union is actually setting standards also for the international platforms. I also would like to say that human rights are universal, but the European continent is equipped with the Council of Europe, which is a unique organization which is setting standards, and the Council of Europe, you mentioned it, of course. Unfortunately, our time has run out. I think we have used it well. The issues are complicated, but this discussion has been a proof of openness, of cooperative spirit, and I think it will be the beginning of a very useful exchange, which Euractiv is willing to continue. So thank you very much, Ms. Gambentova. Thank you very much, Elvira Azimova. I would like also to thank the interpreters. I would like to thank our audience. Please stay tuned. Read Euractiv. And all the best to you. Thank you and goodbye.
Георгий, вам спасибо большое.